want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
Do not be fearful if you believe your philosophy brings people more freedom. Do not be fearful that you could lose your job over it.
It is irresponsible that extreme MAGA Republicans, who are bending the knee to the pro-Putin caucus that is growing in intensity.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said the Senate will return on Monday. That scheduling update matters because it cuts into the Senate's scheduled holiday recess. This will be done to give Senate negotiators more time to see if they can reach a deal on border security. Republicans are demanding massive border policy changes, their words, not mine, in exchange for President Biden's request for some $61 billion in aid to Ukraine. House lawmakers left Washington today for their holiday recess without reaching any agreement on this very difficult issue. They are deferring to Senate negotiators to see if a deal can in fact be reached. The White House is pushing Congress as best it can to pass that $1 billion of aid to Kyiv in the nearest possible time frame. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins us now. Scott is intrepid and knowledgeable as ever. He's also in front of the federal courthouse. Scott, why are you there and what are you waiting for?
We're waiting for a verdict from the jury in the Rudy Giuliani civil defamation trial. He's already been found liable for defamation for what he said, the conspiracy theories he sowed, Major, about those two Georgia election workers. Now the jury's trying to decide how much he should pay for it. Is it millions? Is it tens of millions? Is it 20s of millions? It was a briefer trial than we expected, Major, because Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, the Trump insider who said he was going to testify and tell his side of the story, opted not to testify.
That's important, Scott, because Rudy Giuliani kept talking to reporters outside the courthouse, but never said the things outside the courthouse in the courthouse.
The jury got to hear it, though, Major. On Monday, he had said he made a statement that continued his criticisms and his baseless claims about Shea Moss and Ruby Freedman. He said it outside the courthouse, but the civil plaintiff attorney played a clip of it today for this 8-person jury from the District of Columbia. Again, the judge has already ruled he's liable for defamation. But what the plaintiff's attorney is arguing is that he keeps doing it even after this case began. We'll see if that's a factor when the jury decides how much he's got to pay.
Scott, your other area of expertise, of course, is Congress. Catch us up on the House has left, Senate will stay, negotiations continue. Where are we?
It was a striking moment late today when the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says they're going to stay next week. Such a rarity in Congress for the U.S. Senate to come up close on a holiday. But he wants to extend the time for negotiators to talk about border security, immigration reform as part of this package to fund Ukraine. Now, it's not the tension, but the skepticism is so thick in the air you could cut it with a knife. Not only are some of the negotiators being cautious with how they describe their progress, but some of the Republican senators say they don't see how this can happen in such short order, that next week is going to be relevant. What's more, the U.S. House bailed out of here this morning. They're gone till January 9th. And whatever comes out of the Senate in the name of border security is likely to face steep opposition where the hardliners in the Republican House make up the majority. Let's take a listen to the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who spoke about this issue earlier today.
It is irresponsible that extreme MAGA Republicans, who are bending the knee to the pro-Putin caucus that is growing in intensity amongst Republicans in the House and in the Senate, have irresponsibly injected other items, albeit we understand the need to address the situation at the border, but nonetheless have injected other items into this discussion.
And I think that's the underreported issue here, Major. No matter how these border negotiations go, what a precedent is being set right here, right now in Washington, where an emergency aid bill to fund a war effort is now coming as part of a package deal. You have to give us something to get something. That was rarely the case, if ever the case, for emergency war funding in years past. This border negotiation is real. It's just not clear, Major, how soon it ends.
You mentioned, Scott, that House Republicans and the entire House body has left. That means Kevin McCarthy, who very recently was Speaker of the House, is leaving. What did he have to say?
It has very practical implications. This narrow majority just got narrower. He likely will not be voting again in the U.S. House. Take a listen to his farewell speech earlier this afternoon.
Do not be fearful if you believe your philosophy brings people more freedom. Do not be fearful that you could lose your job over it.
A year that ended with history in a 15-round speaker vote to elect McCarthy ends with McCarthy leaving voluntarily. Year 2023 in Congress was quite something, wasn't it?
Bookends on a history-making Congress, though maybe not in the ways it would like to make history. Scott MacFarlane, thanks so very much. As Scott mentioned, and as we discussed, the White House is open to supporting new and tougher border policies in talks with lawmakers, Republican and Democrat. Among the policy changes the White House is open to expelling migrants and an expansion of detention policies. Some progressive Democrats are not happy about this and are beginning the process of attempting to push back on those potential changes. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us with that angle on the story. Ed, pick it up from there.
Well, Major, we now know the White House is engaging with the Senate on the details of this. What we don't entirely know is to what extent the president himself might be on the phone with Democrats and Republicans who are trying to cut the deal, or at least with Senate leadership. One thing that has been exposed over the course of this week, though, is that whenever the president tries to push an issue back to the middle, it, of course, upsets progressives in his party. He's done that again this week, in part because there aren't as many of them in the Senate in positions of negotiating power to sort of conduct those talks. And they've been boxed out of this, of course, because they're not necessarily in the Senate. The other group that got a little ticked off about all this week is the growing number of Latino lawmakers in the Democratic House and Senate caucuses, whose numbers are growing, but whose level of seniority is such that they don't still necessarily have direct oversight or leadership of matters of appropriations, budget, homeland security, border security. So they're not naturally, and they're not a standout moderate deal cutter. So they're not necessarily engaged in these talks. And they've thrown a bit of a fit about this and suggested that the White House is throwing Latino voters under the bus. We tried to clarify this today with the White House as to whether or not they've been brought into the conversation. The press secretary suggests they have. But the chairwoman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus told me earlier today she's heard from just one senior White House official. The Hispanic Caucus, after requesting a briefing on all of this, has not received one yet, and they are not being brought up to speed, which may not matter ultimately in the vote count, but certainly matters in the broader politics and the White House's relationship with Congress and with members of its own party.
And it feels, Ed, as if there's been a bit of a seismic shift in what the White House is open to considering. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, things that House Republicans were talking about were dismissed almost entirely by the White House. They're not as dismissive anymore.
And Republicans point out and make a valid point that the White House was silly to be doing that because it was the president, when he made this initial emergency spending request, that included requests for more money for border security and changes potentially in border policy, opened the door to it himself by putting it in that original package. The White House presumed that by extending that olive branch, Republicans would be fine to just provide a little more money. Instead, it's turned into this broader negotiation over issues of immigration and border security policy. But here's the raw politics of it. You look at our CBS News poll out this week, 20% of Americans now say immigration and border issues are the top concern. That's the second issue on the list now, just behind inflation. It has shot up, higher than gun violence, higher than concerns about the state of democracy, or the state of abortion access, or the war in Gaza. So the White House looks at all this, and our polling isn't the only one saying it, and says, we got to act on it. Oh, by the way, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people are crossing the U.S.-Mexico border every day. Highest numbers in some cases this time of year ever. So they have to act and understand that the politics of this are not in their favor. They're going to get hit by all sides.
Ed, you mentioned the war in Gaza. The president said today he wants Israel to be more careful. Can you expand upon that?
Well, I think we have the video of it that we can play people. We should see it first if we can.
Okay, let's listen.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
That short answer, Major, is in response to reporting today that the Biden administration, through the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who's in the region this today and tomorrow, is essentially telling the Israelis, get this over with by the end of the year. Administration officials here at the White House today denied that, and then you see the president himself saying, no, just be more careful. The challenge, of course, is this is urban warfare that we have not really seen before. The other problem, of course, is that so many civilians have been killed as Israel tries to root out Hamas leadership. And just this week, finally, publicly, the president has been far more skeptical and critical of Israeli leadership, not saying get it over with, not saying stop it. You saw him there pretty clearly say, go after Hamas, but be more specific or more careful about it. That's a departure from the last several weeks, but again, is rooted in domestic politics. He's heard and seen in polling members of his own party increase their opposition to his support for Israel. And the world over is quite concerned about this. Even at the UN this week, there were attempts to stop all this. And of course, the U.S. stepped in and tried to stop it. So another big challenge for him amid all the others.
Ed O'Keefe coming to us from the North Lawn of the White House. Thanks so very much. Next, John Kirby of the National Security Council joins us to discuss efforts on the White House's behalf to get Congress to approve aid to Ukraine and other issues, and whether or not it was a mistake for the White House to put that Ukraine aid alongside funding for Israel and border policy. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden this week said that Russia is celebrating, as he said, celebrating Congress's inability to pass funding for Ukraine. The White House says it is willing to compromise on border policy in order to obtain from Congress that Ukraine aid. Earlier today, I spoke with National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, John Kirby. I want to read to you a lead paragraph produced in Moscow by the Associated Press about President Vladimir Putin's question and answer session today. Quote, emboldened by battlefield gains and flagging Western support for Ukraine, a relaxed and confident President Vladimir Putin said Thursday there would be no peace until Russia achieved its goals, which he says remain unchanged after nearly 2 years of fighting. Admiral Kirby, is there anything in that AP lead paragraph with which you disagree?
I don't think there's any reason why Mr. Putin should feel emboldened by battlefield successes, because he hasn't achieved any significant battlefield successes for many, many, many months. In fact, the Ukrainians have, with our help and assistance and those of like 50 other countries, clawed back more than 50% of the territory that the Russians took in the early months of the war. So while his strategic goals haven't changed, his ability to achieve them he's nowhere closer. That said, and this is an important point, Major, his goals haven't changed, and that should give us all pause for how long he might be willing to continue to strike at civilian infrastructure, to kill Ukrainian soldiers and fight units on the ground in the east and in the south. And that's why that supplemental funding request that we've got up on Capitol Hill is so important, because his goals haven't changed. We've got to make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to continue to defend themselves and to claw back even more territory.
Admiral Kirby, you know well the House of Representatives has left for its Christmas work period or recess. That means the status of that supplemental funding request is at best in limbo, possibly dead until the new year. Your reaction?
Well, it's a dangerous time of the year to be walking away from Ukraine. This is not the time to go home for the holidays and to have eggnog. This is the time to step up and prove to the world and to Mr. Putin that we mean what we say when it's not okay for him to invade a neighboring nation. Our strong message to those House Republicans who decided to hold hostage Ukraine funding is stay in town, do the critical work. We're willing to sit down at the table and negotiate over issues like the border. This is now not the time to be walking away from Ukraine.
But they've left, Admiral Kirby. They're already gone.
Well, that's I understand that. We'd like to see him come back, and we'd like to see him sit down and do what's right for Ukraine. This is, again, a critical time of the year, critical months ahead here. And as I also said, the president and our team are willing to sit down and negotiate. We're willing to have a constructive conversation about border security and even border policy. But you can't do that if the other partner decides to walk away.
Admiral Kirby, is it possible that there would still be some money to assist Ukraine through the early part of this year, meaning if Congress came back and got this done, let's say the first, second, maybe third week of January, there would not be a gap?
That would still be a gap. That said, we have enough funding left to get us probably some additional security assistance to Ukraine before the end of this year. And it will take some time, days, maybe even weeks, before all of that gets to Ukraine. So if we were able to get funding very early on in January, it's safe to assume that we could continue to flow in a relatively uninterrupted way. Thus far, Major, we've been providing security assistance about every 2 weeks. So if we have another bout that we can get in before the end of this month, if we can do something by early to mid-January, that would keep up that rotation, and it would certainly help there be an uninterrupted flow.
From the vantage point of the White House, was it a mistake to put Ukraine, Israel, and border issues together?
No, they're all in together because they all are urgent emergency needs by the United States for our national security. And what's going on in Ukraine affects our national security, same as what goes on in Israel and obviously down at the border. All of these were legitimate requests that the administration made based on critical national security needs. No, we don't regret that at all. And again, Major, we're willing to have a good faith negotiation over border security and immigration policy.
Several House Republicans have told me if the policy concessions now on the table had been communicated a month ago, this deal might have gotten done, and they blame the White House for waiting so long to get to the table and seriously negotiate. Your response?
Look, I'd let the House Republicans speak for themselves on that. I mean, we put this supplemental request on the Hill back in October. I mean, this isn't something.
But without
new.
the policy concessions, Admiral Kirby, you know that was money, not policy.
We put the supplemental request back in October. We said then we're willing to have a serious conversation. If they're serious, then they wouldn't have left for Christmas.
Interesting. When the president said earlier this week that there had been indiscriminate bombing by Israel in Gaza, what did he mean?
He's talking about concerns, genuine concerns that we've had about the Israelis' intent to minimize civilian casualties and yet not have always the results and the outcomes to that effect, and that there have been many thousands of innocent Palestinians killed and many, many thousands more wounded. And we want to see no civilian casualties. That's the right number, 0. So he's expressing a genuine concern that we've had and that we've expressed to our Israeli counterparts about being more surgical, more precise, more deliberate, more cautious in how they're going after legitimate Hamas targets.
This administration believes in a two-state solution. Do you believe the Netanyahu administration does as well?
I'll let Mr. Netanyahu speak for his own intents there. I can only tell you that President Biden still believes that in the promise and the potential of a two-state solution. We understand that that's going to be elusive right now, that we're not close to getting there. But in conversations that Jake Sullivan, who was in Riyadh yesterday, had with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, it was clear that the Saudis are willing to move forward on this idea of normalization between the two countries. Again, we're not close to that. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But that's an important step to getting maybe to a two-state solution. But here's the thing, Major. A two-state solution is going to require leadership on both sides, on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. The right kind of leadership that's willing to be transformative, leadership that is willing to see peace and security for the Israeli people and for the Palestinian people. President Biden's not giving up on that hope, and he's not giving up on the conversation that we're willing to have with leaders on both sides about being those kinds of leaders.
Admiral John Kirby with the National Security Council, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.
Re-election concerns, well, they're growing at the Biden White House due to, among other things, the president's slipping support among constituencies, some of them very important. African Americans fall into that category. We'll discuss that next. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Winning one presidential election does not guarantee you will win the next. You know that. I know that. What you have to do is maintain the constituency that won for you the first time and, if possible, expand it, which brings us to something the Biden White House is concerned about, that core constituency from 2020. Specifically for this conversation, African Americans. To help us understand this a bit better, CBS News political contributor Ashley Etienne joins us now. Ashley is also the former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. All right, Ashley, describe the depth of concern and how legitimate that concern is.
Well, I mean, it's almost to the point of hair on fire within the party.
Okay.
I mean, as the New York Times reported just yesterday, I believe, that African-American male leaders in particular went and met with the White House and really made the point and sounded the alarm that that the party's having some problem with black voters. There's poll after poll that's showing that upwards of 22% of African-Americans are saying in key battleground states that they're willing to not support President Biden. There's never been a Democrat that's ever won an election, specifically the White House, with less than 80% of the African-American vote. So as you can imagine, this is incredibly alarming. The other thing that makes it, I would say, a major concern for the party is that the trend is moving in the wrong direction. African-Americans are starting to support the Republican Party in higher numbers, 6% in 2016, 8% in 2020. So there's some big concerns about how the party is really responding and engaging African-American voters, specifically African-American men.
Does the data suggest apathy or absolute opposition to President Biden?
What the party's most concerned with is how we're effectively engaging African-American voters, right?
To deal with either one of them, whichever it is, apathy or opposition, you got to engage.
Absolutely, because both of them are bad, right, ultimately. but here's the main concern is that we're not effectively engaging African-American voters and don't have the appropriate messengers to really penetrate and block out all the noise. So two things that have happened just most recently that the party has never done as early in the cycle as they have this time around. One is they went up just last week with ads in battleground states targeting African-Americans, specifically featuring African-American men touting the president's agenda, accomplishments, specifically around infrastructure and what it's meant in his life. The second is there's a big meeting happening tomorrow. The Democratic campaign committees from the DNC to the D-Trib to the
Meaning
DSCC,
House, Senate, National Party,
all of them above, are bringing together Black operatives from field to media to messaging to talk about the lessons learned from the last two cycles and how we're effectively engaging the African-American community. And I will say, just based on my experience with the campaign, I think the top takeaway is that we were found very flat-footed as it relates to responding and combating disinformation. Dating all the way back to the 2016 election, there have been reports, congressional hearings about Russian bots specifically targeting African Americans with different disinformation to suppress the black vote. So that's what I was most surprised with, is that we were so flat-footed and had no plan to really combat in real time what we know was sagging support for Joe Biden.
And you mentioned the lived experience of 2020. Was there ever a point in time in 2020 where there were similar concerns about African-American support and then candidate nominee Biden?
Absolutely.
And you addressed them, or they were addressed or dealt with?
Well, it all depends on how. We won the election, so that's the only thing that actually matters. But I think this time around, you have African-American men that are really running the party. From Mr. Jeffries, that's running the House, to the head of the DNC, to the head of Congressional.
Jamie Harrison, right?
Yeah, Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Horsford are running the party. So it really is an opportunity for them. They have their access to the resources. They drive the agenda. They can really take a new approach to engaging African Americans in a way that we've never before. Invest bigger on the front end. And really, I think what they really should do is hire an AI firm, an artificial intelligence firm, to really target and track disinformation in real time and not wait for these polls. In 2020, in the 2020 election, it was about probably 30 days out where we started to see in the polls, internal polls, that we weren't doing very well among African-American men. But we had no way of combating this disinformation. So if the campaign is any kind of smart this time around, and if the African-Americans and the leaders are concerned about this, I think the one thing they should do is hire an AI firm to actually target this disinformation and combat it effectively.
A phrase to keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, if the campaign is any kind of smart. Ashley Etienne, thank you so much. That does it for today. You have been streaming, and you are continuing to stream CBS News.